The morning air was thick with humidity as Captain Sarah Chun adjusted the final calibrations on her advanced stealth suit. The experimental technology had taken 3 years to develop and another 2 to perfect. Now, crouched in the dense jungle foliage just outside the enemy compound, she was about to put it to its ultimate test. The mission briefing had been clear. Intelligence indicated that a high-value terrorist leader was coordinating attacks from a heavily fortified facility deep in hostile territory. Traditional assault methods would result in massive casualties on both sides. Diplomatic solutions had failed. The stealth infiltration was their last viable option before a full-scale military intervention that could destabilize the entire region. Sarah had volunteered immediately when Colonel Martinez outlined the mission parameters. She was the only operative with sufficient training on the prototype stealth technology. The suit could render her nearly invisible to both human observation and electronic detection systems. Thermal dampeners regulated her body heat signature. Sound suppressors minimized her footsteps. Advanced camouflage materials shifted color and texture to match her surroundings. The compound ahead stretched across 15 acres of clear jungle. High concrete walls topped with razor wire formed the perimeter. Guard towers stood at each corner, equipped with searchlights and mounted machine guns. Security patrols moved in predictable patterns along predetermined routes. Electronic sensors monitored every approach vector. The facility housed approximately 60 armed guards, plus support personnel and the primary target. Sarah activated her suit systems one final time. The heads-up display flickered to life, showing green status indicators for all major components. Thermal regulation was optimal. Camouflage protocols were active. Sound dampening was functioning at maximum efficiency. Communication links with base command were secure and encrypted. She began her approach to the outer perimeter. The stealth suit performed flawlessly as she moved through the undergrowth. Branches that should have rustled remained silent. Leaves that should have crackled under her weight made no sound. The advanced materials of her suit shifted constantly, mimicking the colors and textures of her immediate environment. The first checkpoint was a motion detector array positioned along the compound's eastern wall. Sarah had studied the technical specifications extensively during her mission preparation. These particular sensors operated on multiple wavelengths, designed to detect even the slightest movement within their coverage zone. However, the stealth suit's interference patterns could theoretically disrupt their detection algorithms. She approached the sensor line with careful, measured movements. The suit's onboard computer calculated optimal pathways between detection beams. Sarah followed the prescribed route exactly, trusting the technology that had been tested exhaustively in laboratory conditions, but never in actual combat operations. The sensors remained inactive as she passed through their detection zone. The stealth suit was working perfectly. Sarah felt a surge of confidence as she reached the compound's outer wall. The concrete barrier stood 12 feet high, but her suit included climbing assistance technology. Micro grips in her gloves and boots could adhere to virtually any surface. She scaled the wall silently, her movements fluid and controlled. The razor wire at the top posed no significant obstacle. Her suit's outer layer was puncture-resistant, designed to protect against exactly this type of defensive measure. She cut through the wire with specialized tools, creating a narrow passage just wide enough for her body. The compound's interior was laid out according to the intelligence blueprints she had memorized. The main building occupied the center of the facility, surrounded by barracks, equipment storage areas, and vehicle maintenance bays. Guard patrols followed regular routes, changing shifts every 4 hours. Electronic surveillance systems monitored all major pathways and building entrances. Sarah dropped silently into the compound and immediately activated her suit's full stealth protocols. The technology was performing beyond expectations. She was essentially invisible as she moved across the open courtyard toward the main building. Her thermal signature was masked completely. Her footsteps produced no detectable sound. Even her breathing was regulated to minimize any potential detection indicators. The first guard patrol passed within 3 feet of her position. 2 soldiers walked casually along their assigned route, automatic weapons slung across their shoulders. They were discussing their plans for the weekend, completely unaware of her presence. The stealth suit maintained perfect invisibility throughout their passage. Sarah reached the main building without incident. The structure was 3 stories high, constructed of reinforced concrete with minimal windows. Intelligence reports indicated that the primary target occupied a suite of rooms on the top floor. She would need to infiltrate the building, navigate past internal security measures, and reach the target without triggering any alarms. The building's entrance was heavily monitored. Security cameras covered every approach angle. Motion detectors lined the doorframe. Pressure sensors were embedded in the floor just inside the threshold. However, Sarah's mission planning had identified a ventilation intake on the building's north side. The opening was large enough to accommodate a person, and the internal ductwork provided access to the building's upper levels. She positioned herself beneath the ventilation intake and activated her suit's climbing systems. The microgrips engaged with the building's exterior surface as she ascended toward the opening. The climb was straightforward, requiring careful movement to avoid triggering any peripheral detection systems. The ventilation shaft was cramped but navigable. Sarah's suit adjusted its profile automatically, compressing slightly to fit through the confined space. She crawled through the ductwork, following memorized blueprints toward the building's interior. The stealth technology continued to function perfectly, masking her presence from any internal sensors that might be monitoring the ventilation system. 20 minutes later, she reached a junction that provided access to the building's second floor. Sarah carefully removed the vent cover and peered into the hallway beyond. 2 guards were stationed at a security checkpoint approximately 50 feet from her position. They were alert and professional, scanning their assigned area regularly. This would be her first real test of the stealth suit's capabilities in close proximity to trained security personnel. Sarah emerged from the ventilation shaft and began moving down the hallway. The suit's camouflage systems adjusted continuously, matching the colors and textures of the walls and flooring around her. She approached the security checkpoint with extreme caution. The guards were positioned to observe the entire hallway, but they showed no signs of detecting her presence. Sarah passed directly between them, close enough to hear their quiet conversation about the facility's defensive preparations. The stealth suit maintained complete invisibility throughout the encounter. The stairwell to the 3rd floor was located just beyond the checkpoint. Sarah climbed the stairs silently, her suit's sound-dampening systems preventing any noise that might alert personnel on other floors. The technology was performing flawlessly, exceeding all expectations from the testing and development phases. She reached the 3rd floor and began moving toward the target's location. Intelligence reports indicated that the high-value individual occupied a corner suite at the building's eastern end. The approach would require passing several occupied offices and another security checkpoint. Sarah reviewed her mission parameters as she moved through the building's corridors. The elimination was authorized under extreme circumstances. Diplomatic efforts had failed completely. The target was actively coordinating attacks that resulted in significant civilian casualties. Military tribunals had reviewed the evidence and confirmed that immediate action was necessary to prevent further loss of innocent life. Sarah had trained extensively for this type of mission. She was qualified with multiple weapon systems and hand-to-hand combat techniques. However, the stealth suit's capabilities suggested that a silent approach would be most effective. The target could be eliminated without triggering facility-wide alarms, potentially allowing her to extract before enemy forces could organize an effective response. The final security checkpoint consisted of 4 guards positioned around a central monitoring station. They had access to surveillance feeds from throughout the building and compound. Multiple weapon systems were within easy reach. These were professional soldiers with significant combat experience and advanced training. Sarah studied their positions carefully. The checkpoint controlled access to the final corridor leading to the target's suite. There was no alternative route that would avoid detection by conventional means. However, her stealth suit should allow her to pass through the area without being observed. She began her approach with methodical precision. The suit's camouflage systems were functioning at maximum efficiency, adapting to every surface and lighting condition. Her movement patterns followed protocols designed to minimize any possibility of accidental detection. Each step was calculated and deliberate. The guards maintained their professional vigilance as she moved past their positions. Radio communications continued normally. Surveillance monitors showed standard readings from throughout the facility. Sarah was completely invisible to their observation, despite passing within arm's reach of their security station. She reached the target's corridor without incident. The final approach would be the most critical phase of the mission. Intelligence indicated that the high-value individual maintained additional personal security measures beyond the facility's standard protocols. Electronic surveillance was enhanced in this area. Motion detectors operated at maximum sensitivity. Guard patrols were more frequent and less predictable. Sarah moved down the corridor toward the target's suite. Her stealth suit continued to perform perfectly, masking her presence from all detection systems. She was confident in the technology and her own abilities. The mission was proceeding according to plan. The target's door was reinforced steel with multiple locking mechanisms. Electronic sensors monitored the entrance continuously. However, intelligence had provided detailed information about the suite's layout and security measures. Sarah had studied blueprints and floor plans extensively during her preparation phase. She positioned herself outside the target's door and began final preparations for the elimination. Her weapon systems were ready. Communication links with base command remained secure. The stealth suit's status indicators showed optimal performance across all systems. Then, without warning, her heads-up display flickered. The suit's primary power indicator shifted from green to amber. System diagnostics revealed a cascading failure in the power distribution network. Critical components were beginning to shut down in sequence. The thermal regulators went offline first, followed by the sound dampening systems. The advanced camouflage materials began reverting to their default coloration. Sarah felt a surge of adrenaline as she realized the magnitude of the problem. The stealth suit was failing at the worst possible moment. She was deep inside enemy territory, surrounded by hostile forces, with no backup plan for equipment failure of this magnitude. The suit's communication systems remained operational for the moment, but she knew they would fail soon as the power cascade continued. She activated her emergency transmitter and sent a brief burst transmission to base command. Stealth compromised. Equipment failure. Proceeding with mission. The response came immediately. Abort mission. Extract immediately. Repeat. Abort and extract. But Sarah knew extraction was impossible. She was surrounded by 60 armed guards in a heavily fortified facility. Without the stealth suit's capabilities, a conventional exit route would be suicidal. The compound security measures were designed specifically to prevent exactly this type of situation. She had two choices: surrender to enemy forces and face interrogation that would compromise ongoing operations, or complete the mission using conventional tactics. The target was still within reach. The elimination could still be accomplished, but it would require an entirely different approach. Sarah made her decision quickly. The mission was too important to abort. Too many lives hung in the balance. She would complete the objective using whatever methods were available, regardless of the personal cost. The stealth suit's power systems continued their failure sequence. The heads-up display went dark. The microgrip climbing systems shut down. Within minutes, she would be completely visible to enemy forces throughout the facility. Sarah checked her conventional equipment. She carried a suppressed sidearm with 4 magazines of ammunition. A combat knife was secured in a shoulder sheath. 3 fragmentation grenades were attached to her tactical vest. She had basic medical supplies and emergency rations. It was adequate equipment for a quick infiltration mission, but insufficient for the extended engagement that now seemed inevitable. She reviewed her tactical options rapidly. The target was still inside his suite, less than 20 feet away. The corridor was temporarily clear of guards, but patrols would return soon. Security cameras would detect her movement once the stealth suit failed completely. Alarms would sound throughout the facility. The only viable option was a rapid assault on the target's location, followed by an improvised defense until extraction became possible. Sarah would need to eliminate the high-value individual and then hold position against overwhelming odds. It was not an optimal tactical situation, but it was her only remaining choice. The stealth suit's camouflage systems failed completely. Sarah was now fully visible to any observer. She had perhaps 30 seconds before the next security patrol reached her position. The mission parameters had changed dramatically, but the objective remained the same. She moved quickly to the target's door and began working on the electronic locks. Her training included various infiltration techniques that didn't rely on advanced technology. The door's security measures were sophisticated but not impenetrable to conventional methods. Behind her, she heard footsteps approaching along the corridor. The security patrol was returning earlier than expected. Sarah worked faster on the locks, knowing that her window of opportunity was closing rapidly. The first lock disengaged with a soft click. 3 more remained. The footsteps were getting closer. Sarah could hear quiet conversation between the approaching guards. They would round the corner in seconds and discover her presence. She abandoned the lock-picking approach and prepared for immediate action. The mission would now require direct confrontation with enemy forces. Sarah drew her suppressed sidearm and took position beside the target's door. The next few seconds would determine the mission's outcome and her own survival. The 2 guards rounded the corner just as Sarah pressed herself against the wall beside the target's door. Without her stealth suit's camouflage, she was completely exposed in the brightly lit corridor. The guards stopped immediately, their eyes widening in surprise at finding an unauthorized person in the most secure area of the facility. Sarah acted before they could raise an alarm. Her suppressed sidearm fired twice in rapid succession. Both guards dropped silently to the floor, their weapons clattering against the polished concrete. The suppressors had reduced the gunshots to barely audible whispers, but she knew she had only moments before other security personnel discovered the bodies. She quickly returned to working on the door's remaining locks. Her fingers moved with practiced efficiency despite the adrenaline flooding her system. The second lock disengaged, then the third. The final security mechanism required a different approach, but her training covered various lock-picking techniques for exactly this type of situation. Behind her, footsteps echoed from the stairwell. Another patrol was approaching the 3rd floor. Sarah estimated she had less than 60 seconds before they reached her corridor and discovered the dead guards. The final lock was more complex than the others, designed to resist conventional infiltration attempts. She abandoned the careful approach and used a small explosive charge from her emergency kit. The shaped charge was designed for breaching operations, powerful enough to destroy the lock mechanism without causing excessive structural damage. Sarah positioned the device carefully and activated the timer for a 3-second delay. The explosion was muffled, but still audible throughout the immediate area. Alarms began sounding almost immediately as security systems detected the blast. Sarah kicked open the damaged door and rushed into the target's suite, knowing that her stealth mission had officially become a combat operation. The suite's interior was luxuriously appointed with expensive furniture and artwork. Large windows provided views of the jungle surrounding the compound. Electronic equipment lined one wall, including communication devices and computer terminals. The high-value target was seated behind a massive mahogany desk, speaking rapidly into a satellite phone. He looked up in shock as Sarah burst through the doorway. The man was older than his intelligence photograph suggested, with gray hair and weathered features that spoke of decades spent in harsh environments. His eyes held the calculating expression of someone accustomed to dangerous situations. Sarah trained her weapon on him as he slowly set down the phone. "Colonel Hassan," she said calmly, your terrorist activities end now. Hassan smiled coldly. You are American military, he observed, but this is a suicide mission. My guard will kill you within minutes. Perhaps, Sarah replied, but you won't be alive to see it. The terrorist leader's hand moved slowly toward a drawer in his desk. Sarah knew from intelligence briefings that he kept a pistol there for personal protection. She watched his movements carefully, ready to fire if necessary. I have information your government would value highly, Hassan said, his hand freezing near the drawer handle. Killing me would be a strategic mistake. Sarah heard heavy footsteps in the corridor outside. The facility's security forces were responding to the alarm. She estimated at least 6 guards were moving toward the suite. They would breach the door within seconds and overwhelm her with superior numbers. Your information died with the civilians you murdered last month, she said, and pulled the trigger. Hassan fell backward in his chair, the satellite phone tumbling from the desk to shatter on the floor. The primary mission objective was complete, but Sarah's survival prospects had diminished significantly. She was now trapped in a hostile facility with dozens of armed enemies converging on her position. She quickly searched Hassan's desk for any intelligence materials that might prove valuable. Several documents appeared to contain operational information about planned attacks. Sarah stuffed them into her tactical vest as the first shots rang out from the corridor. The suite's windows offered a potential escape route, but the drop to the ground was 3 stories with no climbing equipment. Her disabled stealth suit's microgrip systems would have made the descent manageable, but conventional methods would likely result in serious injury or death. The door to the suite exploded inward as enemy forces used breaching charges to gain entry. Sarah had positioned herself behind the massive desk for cover. The furniture was solid hardwood, thick enough to stop most small arms fire. She returned fire immediately as armed guards rushed through the doorway. Her first shots dropped 2 attackers before they could establish firing positions. The suppressed weapon gave her a tactical advantage in a confined space. The remaining guards couldn't immediately locate her position among the furniture and equipment scattered throughout the room. Sarah moved constantly, using the suite's layout to her advantage. The expensive furniture provided multiple defensive positions. She worked her way around the room's perimeter, engaging targets when opportunities presented themselves. Her ammunition was limited, so every shot had count. The guard were professional soldiers with significant combat experience. They advanced methodically, using proper tactical formations and covering fire. Sarah recognized their techniques from her own military training. These weren't inexperienced militia fighters, but trained professionals who understood urban combat operations. She eliminated 2 more attackers before her position became untenable. The guards had identified her location and were concentrating their fire on her defensive position. The desk was beginning to splinter under sustained automatic weapon fire. Sarah needed to relocate immediately. The communication equipment along the wall offered her next defensive position. She sprinted across the room under heavy fire, diving behind a bank of electronic consoles. Bullets sparked off metal surfaces and shattered computer screens around her. The equipment provided adequate cover, but she was running low on ammunition. Sarah counted her remaining rounds. 2 full magazines plus the partial magazine currently in her weapon. Against the number of guards in the facility, her ammunition wouldn't last long. She needed to change tactics if she hoped to survive long enough for extraction. The suite's bathroom offered a more defensible position. Sarah made another sprint under fire, reaching the smaller room and slamming the door behind her. The bathroom's layout provided natural choke points that would limit the guard's ability to overwhelm her with superior numbers. She quickly assessed her tactical situation. The bathroom had no windows, eliminating escape options, but also preventing enemy forces from surrounding her completely. They would have to advance through the doorway to engage her, limiting their numbers and giving her a defensive advantage. Sarah positioned herself in the bathroom's far corner, with clear lines of sight to the doorway. She checked her remaining equipment: 3 fragmentation grenades, a combat knife, basic medical supplies, and approximately 90 rounds of ammunition. It wasn't much against 60 armed guards, but it would have to suffice. The enemy forces regrouped in the main suite. Sarah could hear their voices as they planned their assault. They were being cautious, recognizing that she had already eliminated several of their colleagues. The tactical situation favored the defender in this confined space. The first assault came 5 minutes later. 3 guards rushed through the doorway simultaneously, hoping to overwhelm her with concentrated fire. Sarah was ready for them. Her first shots dropped the lead attacker in the doorway, creating a temporary obstacle for the others. The second guard stumbled over his fallen colleague, providing Sarah with an easy target. The third retreated hastily back into the main suite. Sarah used the lull to change her magazine. She was down her last 2 full magazines. The arithmetic was simple. Even with perfect accuracy, she couldn't eliminate all the guards in the facility. She needed to find another solution or accept that the mission would end with her death. The guards tried a different approach for their second assault. They used flashbang grenades to disorient her before advancing. The explosions were deafening in the confined space, but Sarah had anticipated this tactic and positioned herself to minimize the effects. Her return fire drove them back again. After the third failed assault, the guards changed their strategy completely. Instead of direct confrontation, they began systematically destroying the bathroom's infrastructure. Automatic weapon fire shredded the plumbing and electrical systems. They were trying to make her position untenable without risking additional casualties. Sarah realized they were also buying time for reinforcements to arrive from other parts of the facility. Her radio intercepts suggested that additional guards were being recalled from perimeter duties to deal with the intruder. Her tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. She decided to take the initiative rather than wait for the enemy's next move. Sarah prepared one of her fragmentation grenades and cooked it for several seconds before throwing it into the main suite. The explosion scattered the guards who had been preparing for another assault. Sarah charged through the doorway immediately after the explosion, catching the surviving guards off balance. Her aggressive tactic surprised them, and she eliminated 3 more attackers before they could react effectively. However, her ammunition situation was becoming critical. The suite was now littered with broken furniture and electronic equipment. Bodies of enemy guards lay scattered around the room. Sarah had eliminated 12 attackers so far, but she could hear more reinforcements arriving in the corridor outside. The facility's entire security force was converging on her position. She moved to Hassan's desk and activated his communication equipment. The satellite phone was destroyed, but other devices appeared functional. Sarah attempted to contact her base command, hoping to provide intelligence about the mission status and request immediate extraction. The communication attempt was partially successful. She managed to transmit a brief message. Primary objective complete. Hassan eliminated. Request immediate extraction. Position surrounded. Stealth suit failed. The response was immediate but not encouraging. Extraction not possible. Enemy air defenses active. Hold position. Support inbound. Sarah understood the implications. Her support team was hours away at minimum. She would need to survive against overwhelming odds until help arrived. The tactical situation required a fundamental change in approach. She gathered Hassan's intelligence documents and any other materials that appeared valuable. The computer hard drives were damaged beyond recovery, but paper documents had survived the firefight. Sarah secured them in her tactical vest alongside her remaining ammunition and equipment. The next enemy assault would be more coordinated and overwhelming than the previous attempts. Sarah could hear officers shouting orders in the corridor. They were organizing a final push to overwhelm her defensive position with superior numbers. Rather than wait for their attack, Sarah decided to change the rules of engagement entirely. She would take the fight to them, using mobility and surprise to offset their numerical advantages. The passive defense had served its purpose, but now she needed to become the aggressor. Sarah checked her remaining equipment one final time. 1 fragmentation grenade, half a magazine in her weapon, one spare magazine, and her combat knife. Against at least 40 remaining guards, conventional tactics would be insufficient. She needed to think beyond standard military doctrine. The facility's layout worked against the defenders if she could exploit it properly. The guards were concentrated in the upper floors, but the building's infrastructure offered opportunities for asymmetric warfare. Sarah began formulating a plan that would use the compound's own systems against its defenders. She moved to the suite's window and assessed the exterior wall. Without her stealth suit's climbing systems, a direct descent was impossible. However, the building's architecture included decorative ledges and utility fixtures that might support her weight. The risk was enormous, but remaining in the suite guaranteed her death. Sarah opened the window and began her descent. The night air was cool against her face as she carefully moved along the building's exterior. Her military training included basic climbing techniques, but this was far more challenging than any exercise she had attempted. The descent required absolute concentration. One mistake would result in a fatal fall to the courtyard below. Sarah moved slowly and deliberately, testing each handhold before committing her full weight. The decorative ledges were narrower than they appeared from a distance. Halfway down the building's exterior, she heard shouts from the third floor. The guards had discovered her absence from the bathroom and were searching for her location. Flashlight beams swept across the building's facade, but Sarah had positioned herself beneath an architectural overhang that provided concealment. She completed the descent and dropped silently into the compound's courtyard. The facility's interior was now in chaos as guards searched for the intruder they assumed was still inside the building. Sarah's unconventional exit had bought her temporary freedom of movement. Now she needed to exploit the confusion to maximum effect. The compound's defenders were concentrated inside the main building, leaving other areas less heavily guarded. Sarah began moving toward the facility's infrastructure targets, carrying out a new plan that would turn the hunters into the hunted. Sarah crouched in the shadows beside the main building, watching guard patrols rushing toward the chaos inside. Her descent had gone unnoticed, giving her a crucial tactical advantage. The enemy forces were focused on searching the upper floors for an intruder they assumed was still trapped inside Hassan's suite. She studied the compound's layout with fresh eyes. The mission had evolved beyond a simple elimination operation. With dozens of hostile forces actively hunting her, Sarah needed to think like a guerrilla fighter rather than a stealth operative. The facility's own infrastructure would become her weapon. The compound's power generation system was housed in a separate building near the eastern wall. Intelligence briefings had identified it as a backup diesel generator system with fuel storage tanks. If she could disable the electrical grid, the facility's sophisticated security systems would fail, and the guards would lose their technological advantages. Sarah moved carefully across the courtyard, staying close to walls and using parked vehicles for concealment. The compound's lighting system created deep shadows between the buildings, providing natural cover for her movement. Most of the exterior guards had been recalled to search for her inside the main building. The generator building was smaller than the others, but more heavily constructed. Its reinforced walls were designed to contain potential explosions from the fuel storage systems. 2 guards were stationed outside the entrance, but they appeared nervous and distracted by the commotion from the main building. Sarah approached their position from behind, using a maintenance shed for concealment. The guards were focused on the main building, where muzzle flashes and shouting indicated that the search was still ongoing. They had no reason to expect an attack from their rear. She eliminated both guards silently using her combat knife. The suppressed sidearm would have been faster, but she needed to conserve ammunition for later encounters. The knife work was precise and efficient, skills honed through years of military training. Both guards dropped without making any sound that would alert other personnel. Sarah dragged the bodies into the shadows beside the building and quickly searched their equipment. Each guard carried additional ammunition compatible with her weapon, plus fragmentation grenades and communication devices. The extra supplies would prove invaluable for the extended engagement ahead. The generator building's door was locked, but not heavily reinforced. Sarah used her lock-picking skills to gain entry quickly. Inside, massive diesel engines hummed steadily, providing electrical power for the entire facility. Fuel lines ran throughout the building, connecting the engines to storage tanks outside. Sarah assessed the system's vulnerabilities. The fuel lines were the most obvious target, but damaging them would create a fire hazard that might trap her inside the building. The electrical distribution panels offered a safer option for disabling the power grid without causing immediate structural damage. She located the main electrical panel and began systematically destroying the control circuits. Her combat knife served as an improvised tool for severing power cables and damaging critical components. Within minutes, she had disabled the primary electrical distribution system. The compound's lights began failing in sequence as the power grid collapsed. Emergency lighting activated automatically, but the illumination was minimal compared to the normal floodlight systems. The facility's electronic surveillance network went dark immediately, eliminating the defender's ability to monitor her movements remotely. Sarah heard shouts from across the compound as the guards realized their electrical systems had been sabotaged. Radio communications crackled with confused reports about power failures and system malfunctions. The enemy forces were beginning to understand that their quarry had escaped the main building. She prepared to leave the generator building when she heard footsteps approaching outside. A patrol had been dispatched to investigate the power failure. Sarah positioned herself beside the doorway and waited for the guards to enter her killing zone. 3 guards rushed through the entrance with weapons raised. They were using flashlights to illuminate the interior, but the bright beams actually hindered their vision by creating harsh contrast between light and shadow. Sarah remained motionless in the darkness until all 3 were inside the building. Her first shots dropped 2 guards before they could react. The third spun toward her muzzle flash, but Sarah had already moved to a new position. She fired again from the shadows, and the final guard collapsed beside his companions. The entire engagement lasted less than 10 seconds. Sarah quickly gathered additional ammunition and equipment from the fallen guards. She now had sufficient supplies to sustain extended combat operations. More importantly, she had eliminated 5 guards without the enemy forces understanding her new tactical approach. The facility's communication system was her next target. Intelligence briefings had identified the main communications antenna on top of the administration building. If she could disable their radio network, the defenders would lose coordination capabilities and be forced to rely on visual signals and messengers. Sarah exited the generator building and began moving toward the administration facility. The compound's reduced lighting worked in her favor, providing numerous concealment opportunities as she crossed open areas. Emergency lighting created pools of dim illumination separated by deep shadows. The administration building was 2 stories high, with external stairways leading to the roof. The communication antenna was clearly visible against the night sky, along with several smaller installations for different radio frequencies. Destroying the entire array would require careful placement of her remaining explosive charges. 2 guards were stationed at the building's entrance, but they were focused on monitoring radio reports about the power failure and the ongoing search for the intruder. Sarah approached from a blind spot and eliminated both guards quickly and silently. She climbed the external stairway to the roof, moving carefully to avoid creating noise that might alert other personnel. The metal steps were designed for maintenance access rather than tactical operations, requiring deliberate movement to prevent detection. The roof provided an excellent view of the entire compound. Sarah could see guard units moving between buildings as they searched for her. Most of the facility's personnel were concentrated around the main building, but smaller teams were beginning to spread out to secure critical infrastructure. The communication antenna was more complex than she had anticipated. Multiple dish arrays and radio masts served different functions within the facility's communication network. Sarah would need to destroy the entire installation to effectively disrupt enemy coordination capabilities. She used her last fragmentation grenade as an improvised explosive device, positioning it among the antenna supports with a timer delay. The explosion would need to be precisely timed to allow her escape from the roof before the blast attracted enemy attention to her location. Sarah activated the timer and immediately began descending the external stairway. She had approximately 30 seconds to reach ground level and move to a safe distance. The explosion would be visible throughout the compound and would certainly draw immediate response from the facility's security forces. The grenade detonated just as Sarah reached the building's base. The explosion destroyed the entire communication array, sending debris raining down across the roof and surrounding area. Radio communications throughout the facility went silent immediately, leaving the guards without centralized coordination. Sarah used the confusion following the explosion to move toward her next objective. The vehicle maintenance bay housed the facility's transportation assets, including several trucks and armored vehicles. Disabling the motor pool would prevent enemy forces from pursuing her during extraction or calling in reinforcements from outside the compound. The maintenance bay was located near the compound's western wall, away from the main concentration of buildings. Guards were stationed around the facility's perimeter, but they were spread out to cover multiple approach routes. Sarah would need to eliminate them systematically to avoid raising an alarm. She approached the first guard position from the rear, using maintenance equipment for concealment. The guard was positioned near a fuel pump, monitoring the area between the motor pool and the compound's outer wall. He appeared alert, but was focused on potential threats from outside the facility. Sarah eliminated him silently and moved immediately toward the second guard position. Speed was essential now that the enemy forces were actively searching for her. Each delay increased the probability of discovery and engagement with superior numbers. The second guard was positioned inside the maintenance bay, conducting routine inspections of the vehicles. Sarah entered the building through a side entrance and approached his position using the parked trucks for concealment. The interior lighting was minimal, providing adequate shadows for her approach. She eliminated the second guard and immediately began sabotaging the vehicles. Her combat knife punctured fuel lines and destroyed electrical systems throughout the motor pool. Within minutes, she had disabled every vehicle in the facility, ensuring that enemy forces would be unable to pursue her during extraction. The third and fourth guard were positioned outside the maintenance bay, covering different sectors of the compound's perimeter. Sarah would need to eliminate them before they discovered the damage to the vehicle fleet or the bodies of their colleagues. She exited the maintenance bay through the rear entrance and circled around to approach the third guard from his blind spot. The guard was using binoculars to scan the jungle beyond the compound's outer wall, watching for potential rescue forces that might be approaching the facility. Sarah eliminated him quickly and moved toward the final guard position. This guard was stationed near the compound's main gate, the most heavily fortified position in the facility's perimeter defenses. The approach would be more challenging due to the open ground and additional lighting around the gate area. She used the confusion from her previous attacks to her advantage. Guards throughout the facility were responding to multiple crisis situations simultaneously. Radio communications were down, electrical power was failing, and several personnel were missing from their assigned positions. The enemy's command structure was beginning to collapse. Sarah reached the final guard position as reports of the vehicle's sabotage began circulating among the remaining defenders. The guard at the main gate was receiving visual signals from other positions, trying to maintain some coordination despite the communication blackout. She eliminated the final perimeter guard and immediately moved to her next objective. The facility's fuel storage area contained thousands of gallons of diesel fuel and aviation gas. A properly executed attack on these systems would create chaos throughout the compound and provide cover for her eventual extraction. The fuel storage area was protected by additional security measures, including motion detectors and automated systems that had survived the electrical grid failure. However, these systems operated on backup power that would fail eventually. Sarah needed to time her attack carefully to maximize its effectiveness. She positioned herself near the fuel storage tanks and prepared for the most dangerous phase of her improvised assault. The explosion would be massive and visible for miles, certainly alerting any enemy forces outside the compound to the facility situation. However, it would also provide the distraction she needed to reach the extraction point. Sarah planted explosive charges using materials salvaged from the guards she had eliminated. The charges were small, but positioned at critical points in the fuel system infrastructure. The resulting explosion would be enhanced by the thousands of gallons of stored fuel, creating a fireball that would illuminate the entire jungle. She activated the timing devices and began moving toward the compound's outer wall. The extraction point was located in the jungle approximately 1 mile from the facility. Sarah would need to traverse hostile territory while enemy forces searched for her, but the massive explosion would provide crucial concealment for her movement. The fuel storage area erupted in flames just as Sarah reached the compound's perimeter. The explosion was far larger than she had anticipated, sending a column of fire hundreds of feet into the night sky. The blast wave shattered windows throughout the facility and knocked several guards to the ground. Sarah used the chaos to scale the outer wall and escape into the surrounding jungle. Behind her, the facility burned like a beacon against the night sky. She had eliminated dozens of enemy guards, destroyed critical infrastructure, and completed her primary mission objective. Now she needed to survive long enough to reach the extraction point and return home with Hassan's intelligence documents. The jungle provided immediate concealment, but Sarah knew that enemy forces would soon organize pursuit operations despite their losses. She had perhaps a 30-minute head start before organized search teams could be deployed. The race to the extraction point would test her survival skills against the remaining enemy forces and the hostile environment of the jungle itself. The jungle canopy closed overhead as Sarah pushed deeper into the dense vegetation. Behind her, the compound burned with an intensity that turned night into day. The massive fuel explosion had created a pillar of fire visible for miles, and she knew every hostile force in the region would be converging on the location. Her extraction point was located 1 mile northeast of the facility, at coordinates she had memorized during mission planning. The terrain was challenging even in daylight, with thick undergrowth, steep ravines, and numerous streams creating obstacles to rapid movement. At night, navigation would require careful attention to prevent disorientation. Sarah checked her remaining equipment as she moved through the jungle. 2 magazines of ammunition for her sidearm, Hassan's intelligence documents secured in her tactical vest, a combat knife, and basic survival gear. The failed stealth suit was now dead weight, but its communication systems might still function for emergency transmissions. The sound of pursuit reached her within 15 minutes of entering the jungle. Despite their losses, enemy forces had organized search teams with remarkable speed. Sarah could hear vehicles approaching the compound's perimeter and helicopter rotors in the distance. They were deploying significant resources to recapture or eliminate her. She increased her pace while maintaining noise discipline. The jungle provided natural concealment, but it also amplified sounds in unpredictable ways. A careless step could alert pursuit teams to her location from hundreds of yards away. Sarah's military training included extensive jungle warfare instruction, but this was her first real test of those skills. The first pursuit team entered the jungle approximately 20 minutes after her escape. Sarah could hear their voices carrying through the humid air as they organized their search pattern. They were professional soldiers using proper tactical procedures, not militia fighters stumbling through unfamiliar terrain. Sarah reached a small stream and immediately entered the water. Moving along the stream bed would mask her tracks and scent trail from any tracking dogs the enemy might deploy. The water was knee-deep and flowing toward the northeast, roughly parallel to her intended route to the extraction point. The current was stronger than expected, requiring careful footing to prevent falls that could injure her or create noise. Sarah moved slowly upstream, using exposed rocks and fallen logs to maintain her balance. The stream bed provided excellent concealment, but significantly slowed her progress toward the rendezvous coordinates. After 30 minutes in the water, Sarah heard the distinctive baying of tracking dogs. The enemy forces had indeed deployed canine teams to follow her trail. The dogs would be unable to track her while she remained in the water, but they would pick up her scent again as soon as she returned to dry land. She continued upstream for another 10 minutes before finding a suitable exit point. A large fallen tree created a natural bridge across the stream, allowing her to leave the water without creating obvious tracks on the muddy bank. Sarah climbed carefully onto the log and made her way to solid ground on the far side. The jungle terrain became more challenging as she moved away from the stream. Dense vegetation created natural barriers that required careful navigation. Thorny vines caught at her clothing and equipment. Hidden roots threatened to trip unwary travelers. The canopy was so thick that starlight barely penetrated to ground level. Sarah used her compass and pace counting to maintain her bearing toward the extraction point. Military navigation techniques were essential in this environment where traditional landmarks were invisible in the darkness. She had covered approximately half the distance when the pursuit teams reached the stream behind her. The sound of tracking dogs became more distant as they lost her scent at the water's edge. However, Sarah knew the enemy forces would deploy teams along both sides of the stream to pick up her trail again. Her head start was diminishing as more searchers joined the hunt. The terrain began climbing steadily as she approached a ridge line that separated her from the extraction zone. The slope was steep and covered with loose rocks that created hazards for night movement. Sarah climbed carefully, testing each handhold before committing her weight. A fall here could result in serious injury that would end her escape attempt. Halfway up the ridge, she heard helicopter rotors approaching from the direction of the compound. The aircraft was flying a search pattern with powerful spotlights sweeping the jungle canopy. Sarah pressed herself against the hillside and remained motionless as the helicopter passed overhead. The spotlight beam penetrated the canopy in several places, creating moving pools of harsh white light that illuminated sections of the jungle floor. Sarah was hidden beneath dense vegetation, but the helicopter made several passes over her position before moving on to search other areas. She reached the ridge line after an exhausting climb and immediately began descending the far slope toward the extraction point. The terrain was less steep on this side, but the vegetation was even denser. Sarah had to force her way through walls of tangled growth that seemed designed to prevent human passage. The extraction zone was located in a small clearing beside another stream, coordinates that would allow helicopter landing while providing natural features for navigation. Sarah's support team would be monitoring emergency frequencies for her arrival signal, but the timing would be critical. Too early, and the helicopter might be detected by enemy forces. Too late, and she might miss the extraction window entirely. Sarah reached the valley floor and began following the second stream toward the rendezvous point. The water was shallower here, flowing over a rocky bottom that provided better footing than the muddy stream near the compound. She made better time while still masking her trail from any pursuit teams. The sound of search helicopters became more frequent as enemy forces expanded their search perimeter. Multiple aircraft were now crisscrossing the jungle with overlapping search patterns. Spotlights swept constantly through the canopy, probing for any sign of movement on the ground below. Sarah reached the extraction clearing just as her watch indicated the planned rendezvous time. The area was exactly as described in her mission briefing, a natural opening in the jungle canopy surrounded by tall trees, with the stream providing a clear landmark for navigation. She immediately activated her emergency beacon to signal her arrival. The response was almost immediate. Her extraction helicopter was already airborne and monitoring her frequency. The pilot's voice crackled through the emergency radio. Phoenix 7, we have your signal. Inbound to your location. Estimated arrival 4 minutes. Be advised, hostile air activity in your area. Sarah acknowledged the transmission and began preparing the landing zone. The clearing was large enough for helicopter operations, but she needed to mark the exact landing spot and ensure the area was clear of obstacles that could damage the aircraft during landing or takeoff. She used a small infrared beacon to mark the landing zone center, invisible to the naked eye, but clearly visible to the helicopter crew using night vision equipment. The beacon would guide the pilot to the exact touchdown point while minimizing the aircraft's exposure time in a hostile environment. The sound of approaching rotors reached Sarah 3 minutes later, but she immediately realized something was wrong. Multiple helicopters were converging on her position simultaneously. Her extraction aircraft was inbound from the southeast, but enemy search helicopters were approaching from the west and north. Sarah's radio crackled again. Phoenix 7, be advised, hostile aircraft converging on your position. We are accelerating approach, but you may have company before we arrive. The first enemy helicopter appeared over the tree line, just as Sarah's extraction aircraft came into view from the opposite direction. Both aircraft were using spotlights to illuminate the clearing, creating a surreal scene as competing beams of light swept across the jungle floor. Sarah's extraction helicopter began its final approach despite the presence of enemy aircraft. The pilot was committed to the rescue attempt, even though it would expose his aircraft to hostile fire. Sarah prepared to run for the helicopter as soon as it touched down. The enemy helicopter pilot seemed confused by the presence of another aircraft in the search area. The unexpected encounter had disrupted his crew's standard procedures. Sarah used those few seconds of confusion to sprint toward her extraction aircraft as it settled into the clearing. Enemy forces opened fire just as Sarah reached the helicopter. Automatic weapons fire erupted from the hostile aircraft, tracers streaking across the clearing toward both Sarah and her rescue team. The extraction helicopter's crew chief returned fire with a mounted machine gun while shouting for Sarah to get aboard. Sarah dove through the helicopter's open door as the aircraft began lifting off immediately. The pilot applied maximum power, pulling the aircraft up through the jungle canopy while taking evasive action to avoid enemy fire. Bullets shattered the plexiglass windows and punched holes through the aircraft's thin aluminum skin. The enemy helicopter pursued them as they climbed above the tree line, but Sarah's aircraft had superior speed and maneuverability. The extraction helicopter used terrain features and sudden direction changes to break visual contact with their pursuers. Within minutes, they were flying at high speed toward friendly territory. Sarah collapsed against the helicopter's bulkhead, exhausted from the night's operations. The crew chief checked her for injuries while the pilot transmitted mission status reports to base command. She had survived an impossible situation through skill, determination, and considerable luck. The intelligence documents she had recovered from Hassan's suite would provide valuable information about planned terrorist attacks. Her mission had prevented countless civilian casualties while eliminating a high-value target who had evaded capture for years. The cost had been significant, with major equipment losses and a facility that would require months to rebuild. As the helicopter flew toward friendly airspace, Sarah reflected on the night's events. The stealth suit failure had transformed a simple infiltration mission into an extended combat operation that tested every aspect of her military training. She had eliminated over 50 enemy guards while destroying critical infrastructure and completing her primary objectives. The failed technology had forced her to rely on fundamental military skills rather than advanced equipment. Sometimes the oldest methods were still the most effective. Stealth, when properly applied, wasn't just about invisible suits and electronic countermeasures. It was about thinking differently, using terrain and timing to achieve tactical advantages against superior numbers. Sarah's radio crackled with an incoming transmission from base command. Phoenix 7, mission status report. She keyed the microphone and replied, "Primary objective complete. Hassan eliminated. Intelligence materials recovered. Facility destroyed. Request full debrief upon return to base. Copy all, Phoenix 7. Outstanding work. Medical team standing by for your arrival." Sarah closed her eyes and allowed herself to relax for the first time since her stealth suit had failed. The mission had been successful despite catastrophic equipment failure. She had proven that individual skill and determination could overcome technological disadvantages when properly applied. The helicopter continued its flight toward friendly territory, carrying Sarah and the intelligence materials that would help prevent future terrorist attacks. Behind them, the burning compound served as a reminder that sometimes the most sophisticated missions succeeded through the application of basic military principles rather than advanced technology. As they crossed into friendly airspace, Sarah began mentally preparing her after-action report. The stealth suit failure would require extensive investigation to prevent similar problems in future operations. However, the mission's success proved that elite military personnel could adapt to changing circumstances and complete objectives regardless of equipment failures. The extraction helicopter touched down at the forward operating base just as dawn broke over the horizon. Sarah had survived a night that should have ended with her death or capture. Instead, she had eliminated a major terrorist threat and gathered intelligence that would save countless innocent lives. Medical personnel immediately began checking her for injuries while intelligence specialists secured Hassan's documents for immediate analysis. Sarah's mission debrief would take hours as military analysts documented every aspect of the operation for future training purposes. The failed stealth suit would undergo complete forensic examination to determine the cause of its power system failure. Future missions would include backup protocols to prevent similar equipment malfunctions from compromising operative safety. Sarah's improvised tactics would become part of the training curriculum for other special operations personnel. Colonel Martinez met Sarah as she completed her medical evaluation. "Outstanding work, Captain," he said simply. "The intelligence you recovered has already provided leads on 3 planned attacks. You saved more lives tonight than we may ever know." Sarah nodded wearily. The mission parameters changed, but the objective remained constant. Sometimes that's all that matters. She thought about the 50 guards who had died in the compound, professional soldiers who had been following orders from a terrorist leader. War was never simple or clean, but some missions were necessary to prevent greater tragedies. Tonight had been one of those missions. Sarah completed her debriefing session and, finally, allowed herself to rest. The stealth suit had failed, but her training and determination had not. Sometimes the most advanced technology was no substitute for fundamental military skills applied with intelligence and courage. The mission would become a classified success story, studied by future generations of special operations personnel. It proved that individual operators could overcome seemingly impossible odds when equipment failed and standard procedures no longer applied. Adaptation and improvisation were as important as any technological advantage. As Sarah finally fell asleep in her quarters, she reflected on the night's lessons. Technology was a tool, not a crutch. When the tools failed, the mission could still succeed if the operator possessed sufficient skill and determination. Her stealth suit had broken down, but her training had carried her through to mission completion. The elimination of Hassan and his 50 guards had disrupted a major terrorist network while providing intelligence that would prevent future attacks. Sometimes a single night's work could change the course of an entire campaign. Sarah had proven that individual excellence could overcome technological failure when lives hung in the balance.